From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
I want to introduce you to the Librarian of Congress, Dr. James Billington, and we're going to go ahead and start with that. Welcome, sir.
Thank you very much. Good morning everybody. I hope you notice the smiling crocodiles we've on these orange shirts. This is the Library of Congress staff, excuse me, volunteers. So welcome to you all to the 13th Annual Library of Congress National Book Festival. Today we offer you more than 100 outstanding authors, poets, illustrators for people of all ages and all tastes. There are also many interactive offerings that you'll see for adults as well as children. So I invite you all to stop by the Library of Congress Pavilion and find out more about the library, which has sponsored this event throughout its 13-year history. The library belongs to all of you as well as to the Congress, and it welcomes anyone over the age of 16 to obtain a easily obtainable reader's card. Use our 21 reading rooms on Capitol Hill. And for younger readers, you can enjoy a visit to the library's new Young Readers Center in the beautiful Thomas Jefferson Building. There's some wonderful exhibits there as well, particularly the Civil War one, Early Americas, and Thomas Jefferson's Library. Anyhow, we most sincerely thank the festival's sponsors, Wells Fargo, the Washington Post, Target, the Institute of Museum and Library Services, National Endowment for the Arts, PBS Kids, AT&T, and many other sponsors and partners for their welcome support, which make this a genuine public-private partnership for all of us. Now today it's my distinct pleasure to inaugurate something new on this occasion, the Library of Congress Prize for American Fiction, which is a successor to the Library of Congress Lifetime Achievement Award for the writing of fiction, which we made first in 2008 to the great American writer Herman Wouk. He sent us greetings. He's 97 years old, still working on 2 books ever since the Caine Mutiny. So he's with us in spirit today. And since then, the award has progressed, being given to such luminary writers as John Grisham, Isabel Allende, Toni Morrison, and Philip Roth. Book Festival Creative Achievement Award. Don DeLillo is a master of the postmodern novel for his works, including Mao II, Underworld, and White Noise, which won the National Book Award. His other works include the novels Americana, End Zone, Ratner's Star, Players, Running Dog, The Gnomes, Libra, The Body Artist, and Cosmopolis. Now, if that doesn't send a pretty wide signal of this guy's remarkable coverage and his long and distinguished career. It's very interesting that we awarded it this first time to someone from New York, and contrary to what you might think, all throughout the country there was a very wonderful reaction to this most remarkable author. His most recent book is The Angel Esmeralda, 9 Stories. Like, a little bit like Dostoevsky, from a very different culture, Don DeLillo, in our culture, probes deeply into the social, political, moral life of this country. Over a long and important career, he's inspired his readers with the diversity of his themes and the virtuosity of his prose writing. So it gives me great pleasure to name Don DeLillo the recipient of the first Library of Congress Prize for American Fiction. very briefly, we're told the novel is a doomed object, but here is proof that that's not true at all. Ladies and gentlemen, Maria Rana, who doesn't need me to introduce her. She's familiar to you as one of our National Book Festival authors this year for her excellent biography of Simón Bolívar. She's editor-at-large for the Washington Post. She's a consultant to me and others at the Library of Congress. She will interview Don DeLillo on our stage today. She's done this before with the Nobel laureate. She's an outstanding person. We're grateful to have her. She's going to take the lead in a wonderful two-day celebration in Mexico that we'll have here at the library in December. So we have a great first winner and a marvelous friend to bring out the two of you in a good discussion. So thank you, Marie, and thank you, Don DeLillo.
Thank you very much. I'll say a few words at the podium before we sit down and have a conversation. It's really great to be here. Dr. Billington, thank you for that wonderful introduction. I am so thrilled to have this prize given to Don DeLillo, whom I have admired for so many years. He's really quite a brilliant, astonishing, always original writer, and a great tribute to American literature. So, as you can see, we are in the presence of a prodigiously gifted writer, a novelist whose cool but evocative prose is witty, biting, surprising, and precise. He writes novels on the large scale, aims for America's most pressing social and historical questions, and stretches the norms of narrative to fit the story. He is known for an outsized imagination, but he is also known for meticulous attention to linguistic detail. He has given us work after work that probes the American mindset and captures the temper of our times. Among the most celebrated of those, of course, were the ones that Dr. Billington mentioned, and you all know them: White Noise, Libra, Underworld, Falling Man. I like very much what William Boyd, who is a fine writer in his own right, said about Underworld, and I think it gets to the heart of DeLillo's gifts. So here's what Boyd wrote. In this book, we have a mature and hugely accomplished novelist firing on all cylinders at the sophisticated height of his multifarious powers. Reading the book is charged and thrilling aesthetic experience, and one remembers gratefully that this is what the novel can do, and indeed does better than any other art form. It gets the human condition, it skewers and fixes it in all its richness and squalor, unlike anything else. The novel is the great book of life, and as long as there are human beings who are readers, it will survive, and with a little luck, even flourish. Don DeLillo's Underworld is a formidably potent and hugely encouraging testimonial to this undeniable, indomitable, and strangely consoling fact. Ladies and gentlemen, we will now have a conversation with Don DeLillo. Thank you. Okay. Can everybody hear us? Can you hear us? We'll try it till we get it. Can you hear us now? Can you hear us? A little, turn it up a little bit more. We're getting there. Are we getting there? Can you hear us now? Yes? Higher? I think I'll hold my mic. How's that? And I'll try not to fiddle with it too much. Thank you all for being here. My first question, Don, to you. Thank you so much, first of all, for being here. It's such a delight to have you present on the Mall in Washington, D.C. But my first question to you is really a very human one. Your parents came to America from Italy during the Depression, and you grew up in what I imagine was a hectic little house with 3 generations and 11 children. How did that childhood affect what you write?
I'm not sure what the direct connection may be, but the fact is it was quite a happy household, despite the volume of noise and the number of people. And as I got a little older, it began to occur to me that this place in which I lived, which I could summarize as the Italian Bronx, might be a place worth writing about. And so when I started work, this is what I did. I wrote several short stories set in this area. And 1 or 2 were actually published, to my astonishment. Once I left home to live on my own in Manhattan, I realized that at some level I was repeating the journey that my parents took. That is, traveling from one culture to a completely different culture. And for them, it worked. They came to this country for better lives, and they found them. And now, what I wanted to do was get out of those dark, narrow streets and find America, just as they had done. And this is why, I suppose, my first novel is called Americana.
Now, as I remember, you were working for a while, as really quite a few novelists have done, working in a ad agency, writing ads. And I know that there are many who have done this. Of course, F. Scott Fitzgerald famously worked at an ad agency for a while. Let's think of some others. Joseph Heller worked at an ad agency. I think Salman Rushdie worked at the same ad agency that you did, Ogilvy and Mather. Did that negative influence, positive influence, what did that do to you, that short experience of yours working in the ad agency before you left forever to become a writer?
No influence.
Good answer. Well, as I remember that you said also that being, I think I have it written down here somewhere, that a young writer, which is what you were at the time when you wrote Americana, very young actually, a young writer needs really little more than a piece of paper. Here's what you said. Writing is convenient. It requires the simplest of tools. A young writer sees that with words and sentences on a piece of paper that costs less than a penny, he can place himself clearly in the world. Writing is an inexpensive enterprise.
And that was important in my case. I had an apartment in the middle of Manhattan. I was paying $60 a month, and all I needed was an old typewriter and some paper and my imagination, nothing else. And over a period of years, I found myself in the midst of a novel, to my surprise. It took 2 years before I was convinced that I was a writer. 2 years of nearly daily work before I understood that I was I was a writer, and I would remain a writer despite the fate of this manuscript I was working on. And finally, I did finish, and one day the first finished copy of the book arrived in the mail, and I looked at it and said, well, so what? And then I went to work on another book and another, and here we are, all these years later.
Of course, before you became a writer, you were a reader. And I've also read somewhere that you, actually there are conflicting stories. There's ones that says that you read in the park bench, and there's one that says you read as a lifesaver at a beach or a pool. But it was, or a parking garage, I think it was, working in a parking garage. Could you clarify where you were when you were doing all that reading?
Happily. I was in college, and it was the summer break, and I got a job in a playground in the Bronx. And people who had this job were called parkies for some reason. And it was my job to just watch over the playground and make sure that if there was any kind of violence, that it might be calmed down, and any disturbance at all. And I was supposed to wear a uniform of a white T-shirt and a brown pair of trousers and hang a whistle around my neck. I did none of these things. I sat on a bench reading James Joyce and Hemingway and Faulkner for about 2 months straight. And none of the kids who used the playground knew who I was. And until two of them got in a very serious fight, blood was shed, and I had to take one kid to the hospital. And my cover was broken, but I managed to finish the summer more or less undisturbed.
Don, tell us a little bit about how you actually construct, or how do you find a story?
It's a mystery, and this is one of the wonderful things about writing fiction. We don't know directly how the sources develop, where they come from. In some cases, yes, but often an idea for a story or a book is just a vague image, a visual image. Sometimes it can be a single sentence. A sentence came to mind not so long ago. I won't repeat it, but this one sentence I've been following ever since, and it's the first sentence in a novel in progress. The sentence hit me in such a direct way that I felt I had to go on and justify its existence. And so it's the inspiration for a novel. In other cases, visual images. A man walking on a street, carrying a briefcase, wearing a suit, his face and clothing covered with dust and ash. And I thought, what was this? And I realized it was an image from the terrible events of September 11, 2001. And then it occurred to me that the briefcase the man was carrying was not his. And that's when I decided this might be the beginning of a novel.
The thing that struck me that you said once in your constructing of a novel was that you feel the rhythms and the sounds of a sentence, and that the rhythms and the sound of the sentence drives you through that work on a sentence level, and I really appreciate that, because your writing is actually very musical. There's a musicality to it. It couldn't use, a sentence couldn't use a word more or a word less. It's obviously been very carefully constructed. But then you also said that when you get beyond the sentence, it's almost like sculpting. And so your work, it struck me, because you used both the sound and the sort of visual arts, both sort of craft arts, to describe what you do.
Yes, this is true. At some point, I began to pay much more attention to the shapes of letters, the shapes of words, what they look like, so that to some extent, I'm not only trying to convey meaning, but at least to myself, I'm trying to find a kind of visual responsibility that is an element, a primitive element of visual art in letters and words. And this happened originally when I lived in Greece and had to learn a new alphabet, Greek, and began to see the letters, the shapes of letters, and to begin to understand that this is a visual art, that the alphabet itself can be a visual art. And this is what led me in the direction that I've now taken.
When you say that you saw the man covered in ash carrying the briefcase that wasn't his, at that point, do you sit down and plot out the novel, or do you just let that image carry you along? How much are your novels actually plotted in advance?
They're not plotted at all. They proceed essentially sentence by sentence. I find that discovering the structure of a novel is very important. And at some point, it just occurs to me that the novel ought to proceed in this particular manner, with this structure, perhaps symmetrical, perhaps a structure in which the end of the novel repeats the beginning of the novel. But in many cases, not all cases, in many cases, a structure reveals itself. That's how I have to put it. It reveals itself. It's not something I consciously work at.
So you're laying it down sentence by sentence and until it reveals itself, which is a remarkable thing, really. I remember John Gregory Dunn, who was a critic, and he wrote movie scripts and novels himself, and a journalist, and he said, writing is a little bit like laying pipe. You might as well be laying pipe. You're putting things down, you're building bricks, it's a construction. Do you think pretty much the same thing?
Yeah, I do, absolutely. And one of the peculiar things about writing novels is that it's so immensely unpredictable. I can't plan too far ahead because I don't know what ideas will intervene between this day and when I think I'll be finishing a particular chapter or a particular part of a novel. And so it's very much minute to minute, word to word process.
I think all of you will agree who are Don DeLillo fans and who have read his works that they really are distinguishable by their art at the sentence level. But that doesn't really describe it all the way, because there are sentences that are bright and shiny as gemstones, and then there are sentences that go on endlessly, fluidly. It's almost a little bit like the sentences themselves of the endlessly fluid part, and the way that you write reminds me a little bit of jazz. Was jazz at all an influence in your life, and to what extent would that have been?
Well, I've certainly spent many, many hours, days, and months listening to jazz. And I don't know if I can identify a direct connection, but I do think it's there. Some of the greatest moments I've spent as a young man was in jazz clubs in New York, and to this day on CDs I listen to the same jazz I did when I was 20 years old, the same artists, the same tunes, and it never gets tired. It never becomes repetitive. It's a kind of miracle, and I like to think that my work has some connection to that experience I enjoyed.
You've also said that movies have been a tremendous influence on your life, that along with the reading of the James Joyce and the Faulkner and whatever on the park bench, ignoring the children, you're also going to movies, and movies sort of helped you construct a kind of artistic view of the world.
Well, yeah, but in a way that I could never clearly identify. It's just the visual aspect and the fact that at a certain age I became very conscious of what movies look like, the work of the cinematographer, the way images lapse into other images, the sense of the sense of a classic American image, which to me would be a man on a horse riding across the screen from one end to the other. There's something beautiful and very American about this. And it's not something I would consciously try to duplicate, but it's just the power of images, which I might use that phrase to summarize the themes of some of my work, actually, particularly my first novel and perhaps one or two others. Simply the power of images.
I see you, Don, as being someone, far beyond other writers, someone who really captures the sense of contemporary culture in the way that Thomas Pynchon did in Gravity's Rainbow, or Cormac McCarthy in Blood Meridian, or Norman Mailer in Harlot's Ghost about the CIA. Blood Meridian, of course, was about the taking of the West, and certainly many, if not all of your works, do this. They do this in an astonishing way. They capture who we are, sometimes in very disturbing ways, in ways that you make us look into a mirror, and sometimes the vision is not very pretty, but it is who we are, and it is what we face. And do you do this on purpose? Do you set out in a way to say, in Underworld I'm going to capture a sense of X, in White Noise I'm going to capture a sense of X? Is this a deliberate thing on your part?
No, but I have to add that in 2 months we'll be observing the 50th year of the assassination of President Kennedy. And this event, when it happened in 1963, had enormous impact on the country and much of the world, of course. I had no idea at the time that it would, in a way, define the work I did as a writer. It began to occur to me as I worked through the 70s and into the 80s that my work to some degree was about living in dangerous times. We had that terrible moment in November of '63, followed by Vietnam protests and race riots and other assassination attempts and other assassinations. Robert Kennedy and Dr. King, of course. And eventually, the impact of these events began to seep into the way I thought and the way I write. It never occurred to me that I would actually write a novel about the assassination of the president, but eventually this did take place, and there were 3 years of very intense work and research and thought and second thoughts, but it's something I was driven to do. I felt I had to do it, and I think it changed the way I think of myself as a writer.
You actually said, I think, at some point that
Thank you.
that you could not have written the books that you write before 1963, before the assassination of Kennedy, that everything changed at that point, and the works that we have of yours now could not have existed in a way.
I think that's true. I didn't know it at the time. I had no idea that this would be an event that would affect me as a writer. But yes, it did in a profound way. It seems very strange to me that it's about that 50 years have passed since that day, and here we are again.
You also said that you write to make the simple more complex, which I think strikes me as an astonishing thing. I mean, there are so many of us who are, used to wanting from our writers complexity reduced to the simple. And this is not what Don DeLillo does. He takes the seemingly simple and fleshes it out, throws it against the wall, and makes it very complex. Tell us a little bit about that.
It's very natural. I don't know quite how to explain the workings. As I said earlier, fiction is ultimately a mystery, and I think a writer's mind develops in ways he doesn't necessarily understand. But the idea of living and writing do have these ways to live do have a connection, but it's not identifiable easily, and who knows what a novelist is going to do next. We don't, and this is one of the surprises and pleasures of writing fiction.
I'll ask one more question before we open it up to the audience, so please get ready with your questions and come to the microphones here and here when you'd like to address a question to Don DeLillo. But I want to ask this question, which is important to me at least. You had said that movies were, that the 20th century, that we're just coming out of a century that has been obsessed with movies, has been obsessed with the visual images. You also seem to feel that even as technology gets more advanced, our fears as a public, as a people, as human beings actually becomes more primitive. So even as the world is getting ever more sort of technologically advanced, we are becoming in many ways more sort of Cro-Magnon-like in our instincts or our reactions. There's something that's happening to us in this world as we advance through technological sort of finesse.
Well, in a curious way, despite the enormous powers of technology, I think for many people, it narrows the world rather than widening the world. It makes facts enormously accessible, instantly accessible. But I think as people grow into particularly their personal technology, that it has the ultimate effect of creating a world that's centered on an individual's immediate needs, immediate desires, and excluding much of what is most interesting about the lives we ought to be leading. I think that whatever technology is capable of doing becomes what we desperately need it to do. And I'm not sure that's such a hopeful situation.
Thank you. Questions, please, from the audience. Can we have a few? Great opportunity. We don't often get Don DeLillo with us, so it's wonderful to actually be able to step forward and ask him a question. Over here, please.
It's on? Okay. First, let me say, Mr. DeLillo, thanks for letting me ask you 2 questions 2 days in a row. So, you once wrote in a letter to David Foster Wallace, and I think I have the quote right, that the novel is a fucking killer. And you also, I think he borrowed an image from you characterizing an in-progress novel as a mutant, deformed, drooling baby that follows you around and refuses to ever be more than like one room away. And so I was wondering if you could describe a little bit the pain that can be involved with the pleasure of writing a novel, or the emotional and intellectual stress, or the dark side maybe that you go through.
Yeah, it makes a writer feel inadequate, not only as a writer but as an individual, when things when barriers seem to arise concerning the work you're doing. I remind myself all the time that I've had a lucky life as a writer, and this is true. It could have turned out very differently under slightly different circumstances, and this is what I use when things aren't going well, and the other thing is a kind of patience. I won't describe it as religious in any sense, but there's an element of letting the hours and days pass without due stress and waiting for the moment. It's an element of waiting and being confident that things will change.
Thank you. Over here, please.
Hi, is this working? Yeah, I once did a literature seminar in New York City, and there was this brilliant young girl who wound up going on to the Iowa's Writer Workshop, who at the time was reading Underworld, and she was gushing about it one night at the bar, how much she loved it. And the next morning, she just had to get through the last chapter. And we're sitting there in a seminar, and she's reading, totally ignoring the speaker, gets to the end of the last chapter, shuts the book, and kind of looks at me and says, "What the hell was that?" And
That's what I said.
So, what would you say to her?
I'd say this is modern fiction.
Fair enough, indeed. Thank you. Over here.
My question is also about Underworld, actually. I finished it 2 months ago, and it was amazing. But it also took me keeping notes of all of the characters and months, and felt very different from your other work. And so I think I read once that you said that it was only a novel that a young writer could write.
What kind of writer?
A young writer. And so I'm curious now, looking back on Underworld, as opposed to your other novels, what your thoughts are.
Yeah. Again, the novel is an endless surprise to a writer. I had no idea that I would one day write an 800-page novel. And it just kept building, and the more momentum I felt, the better I felt. This is what the book wanted. This is what the idea wanted, and it took 5 years, and I never begrudged a minute that I spent doing this, and it involved some travel as well. And I was just totally involved every minute of those 5 years. And I felt it driving me in a curious way. I felt a momentum that came right from the book itself, from the pages, from the manuscript, that kept me going and kept me, how shall I say it, happy. I was happy to be doing what I was doing. And I had no idea, not a clue, what the public would think of this book, what anyone would think of this book. Nothing, not even the faintest idea. And it's been that way with me for much of the time, for many of the books. And so my work was rewarded, but I would not have needed a three-dimensional reward. The work itself was the reward.
Thank you for that. Now, we only have time for one or two more questions. Over here, please.
Many of your contemporaries have, most notably Philip Roth, have commented on the future of the American novel, how it's changed in the last half century or so, and have expressed dismay or pessimism at it with all the changing technology and expectations. I was wondering if you share that sort of pessimism of its life and its impact in the future, or if you have the same sense that people have said about your novels, about their flourishing power.
I don't have a sense of pessimism. I think it may well be that readership will diminish a bit, but I think that the best young minds, creative minds, still are drawn to the novel, perhaps more than to any other form. People have a need to write. Young people do. And the novel is the most satisfying outlet for this need and for this ability. It may take various forms, of course, as we want it to. It may be very different 50 years from now. But I think as long as there are people such as yourselves who read and eagerly explore new kinds of fiction, there'll be people to write that fiction.
That's a wonderful note on which to end this session. And let's thank Don DeLillo very much for being with us here today.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.